A wealthy man with 4 bodyguards thought a tired, working-class father would fold the moment they stepped toward him. He was wrong. Within 7 minutes, Cole Maddox, a widowed single dad who worked 3 jobs to keep the lights on, had quietly, efficiently, and without a single wasted movement, put every one of those men on the floor. No rage, no theatrics, just the cold, precise muscle memory of a Navy SEAL who had never truly stopped being one. What happened next inside that forgotten diner would set off a war that shook an entire city and exposed the most powerful predator no one had dared to touch. If you're watching this for the first time, welcome, and I hope you'll stay until the very end because this story builds into something that will stay with you long after it's finished. If this is the kind of storytelling you've been looking for, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and leave a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The diner had no name worth remembering. It sat wedged between a closed-down laundromat and a tire shop that only seemed to operate on Tuesdays, tucked into a block of Harlow Street that most people drove past without looking. The sign above the door had been missing the letter D for so long that regulars had stopped noticing. It just read Ioneer in faded red letters, and somehow that felt appropriate. A place that had given up on impressing anyone. Cole Maddox pushed through the glass door at 8:47 on a Wednesday night and took the same booth he always took when he came here, the one in the back left corner with a sight line to both the entrance and the kitchen pass-through. Old habit. He didn't think about it anymore. He just sat there. He set his phone face down on the table, unzipped his jacket halfway, and let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of the entire day behind it. He'd just finished a 6-hour shift at the warehouse on Kemper Road, unloading freight containers, which paid $11.50 an hour and wrecked his lower back in ways that didn't fully announce themselves until he sat down. In 4 hours, he had to be at the Westgate office complex to start his overnight security rotation. That shift ran until 6 in the morning. In between, there was this: 40 minutes in a warm booth, a cup of coffee, maybe eggs if he had enough cash on him that week. He was 37 years old and he was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix anymore. The diner was about half full. A couple of booths near the window had families, tired parents, kids who should have been in bed already. A man in a work vest ate alone at the counter. 2 women in scrubs shared a piece of pie near the front, the kind of crowd you found in a place like this. People who needed a meal that wasn't going to cost them more than they could afford, in a room that asked nothing of them. A waitress appeared beside his table. Young, maybe mid-20s, dark hair pulled back loose, strands escaping around her face. Her uniform was a pale blue that had been washed so many times it was nearly gray. She had a small smudge of something, ketchup maybe, on the edge of her left cuff, and she didn't seem to have noticed. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please," Cole said. She turned away without writing anything down, which told him she'd been doing this long enough that a single coffee order didn't require paper. He watched her go, not because of anything other than the simple reflex of a man who'd spent too many years in rooms where knowing where people were meant the difference between going home and not. She came back with a mug, filled it without spilling a drop, and set a small laminated menu on the table even though he hadn't asked. "You've been here before," she said. It wasn't really a question. "Few times," Cole said. "The eggs here are better than they look," she offered, and there was something in her voice, not quite a smile, but almost. The particular tone of someone doing their job honestly and without complaint. "I'll probably get the eggs," he said. She nodded and moved off to the next table. Cole wrapped both hands around the mug and stared at the surface of his coffee. He thought about his daughter, Maisie, 7 years old, 2nd grade, currently at Mrs. Peralta's house 2 streets over, where she stayed on the nights his shifts overlapped. Mrs. Peralta was 63 and moved slowly since her hip replacement, but she made Maisie hot chocolate and let her watch nature documentaries past her bedtime, and Maisie adored her. Cole paid her in cash when he could, and in groceries when he couldn't. It was an arrangement built entirely on mutual desperation and quiet trust, and he was more grateful for it than he'd ever found the right words to say. He thought about the electric bill, which was 4 days past due. He thought about Maisie's winter coat, which had a broken zipper, and how she'd been wearing it anyway without saying anything, the way she did when she was trying not to add to his list. 7 years old and already protecting him from things she shouldn't have to know about. He picked up his coffee and drank. The door opened at 8:59. Cole noticed, not because he tried to, but because he always did, the shift in the room's attention, the particular way a space changes when something loud and expensive enters it. Three men came in first, moving in the practiced arrangement of people paid to be obstacles. Big, well-dressed, expressionless. Then a fourth, and then the man himself. Damian Cross was somewhere in his mid-50s, built like someone who'd once been athletic and had since replaced the muscle with tailored clothing and the particular confidence of a man who had not heard the word no in a very long time. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Cole made in a month. His hair was silver at the temples, and he wore it like a credential. His eyes moved across the diner the way a person moves across a parking lot they've already decided isn't good enough for their car. He said something to the man nearest him, and that man moved toward the counter. Cole watched without appearing to watch. The waitress, her, was behind the counter now, refilling a coffee carafe. She looked up when the man approached, and whatever he said to her made her expression tighten. She said something back. He said something else. Then Damian Cross crossed the diner himself, moving with the slow, deliberate ease of someone who never hurried because the world always waited for him. And he reached the counter, and he said something to her that Cole couldn't hear from across the room. She shook her head. And Damian Cross reached out and grabbed her wrist. Not the way you grab someone to get their attention. The other way. The way that's about something else entirely. Cole heard her sharp intake of breath even from the back booth. He heard the way the sound in the room changed. Conversations dropped to near nothing. Forks stopped moving. The collective flinch of a room full of people who had just witnessed something they immediately wanted to not have witnessed. He watched the man at the counter look down at his plate. Watched one of the women in scrubs turn toward the window. Watched the family near the door suddenly become very interested in their menus. Nobody moved. Cole put his coffee mug down. He slid out of the booth. He walked to the counter. Unhurried. Not slow either. Just the particular pace of a man who had already made a decision and wasn't reconsidering it. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that he didn't have to raise his voice. "Let go of her arm," he said. His voice was flat. Not angry, exactly. Just utterly without doubt. Damian Cross turned. He looked at Cole the way certain men look at things that have appeared in their space without permission. The look that said, "I don't know who you are, but whatever you think is happening here, you've misread the situation." "Excuse me?" Damian said. "Let go of her arm," Cole said again. Same tone, same everything. Damian didn't let go. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he's deciding how offended to be. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "Right now I know you're someone with your hand on a woman who doesn't want it there," Cole said. "That's the only relevant information." The room was completely silent. Damian stared at him for a moment. Then something in his expression shifted. The particular shift of a man who had decided not to be embarrassed, only irritated. And he glanced at the nearest of his men with a look that communicated everything without words. Two of them moved toward Cole. What happened next took 11 seconds. Cole had counted, afterward. 11 seconds. That's what it took. He didn't charge them. He didn't shout or posture or show them anything was coming. The first man reached for him with both hands, and Cole stepped slightly to the side and used the man's own momentum to direct him forward, face first into the counter edge, with a controlled, specific force that left the man sitting on the floor, looking confused rather than broken. The second man was bigger and came in lower, and Cole caught the arm, turned at the hip, applied pressure at a precise angle on the elbow joint, not enough to snap it, just enough. And that man made a sound and went down to one knee. The third and fourth men looked at each other. Cole stood where he was, breathing normally. Not one movement wasted, not a scratch on him. "Tell the rest of them to stay where they are," Cole said to Damian Cross. "And let go of her arm." Damian Cross let go of her arm. His face had gone the particular color of a man who is working very hard to maintain the appearance of control over a situation he has completely lost. He looked at Cole, and Cole looked back at him, and in the silence of the diner there was something that had no polite name. The moment when a man who has never truly been checked understands, for the first time, that he has been checked. "You," Damian said quietly, "have made a very serious mistake." "Probably not the first one," Cole said. He turned back to the booth, sat down, picked up his coffee. His hands were steady. His heart rate had barely moved. The waitress brought his eggs without being asked. She set them down carefully, and her hand trembled slightly as she released the plate, though she was clearly trying to make sure it didn't. She had a red mark on her wrist, visible and ugly, that she'd pulled her sleeve down to cover but not quite managed. She looked at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She stood there for a moment like she was going to say something else, and then she didn't. She just nodded once and went back to her job, because she was someone who went back to her job. And he sat there with his eggs and his coffee and let the quiet settle back around him. Damian Cross and his men left, two of them limping, one of them holding his forearm. Nobody in the diner said anything to Cole, but the man at the counter put a hand briefly on Cole's shoulder as he walked past on his way out. Just for a second. No words. Cole nodded. He ate his eggs. He left a $5 tip on a $7 meal, which he couldn't really afford, and went to his car to drive to the Westgate complex. He did not know, sitting in that booth, that by morning the footage of those 11 seconds would be on every screen in the city. He did not know the waitress's name. He did not know what was coming for him. He thought about Maisie's broken zipper. He thought about the electric bill. He drove to work. Cole Maddox had grown up in the way a lot of men from certain kinds of towns grow up, without a great deal of softness. His father worked pipelines, which meant he was gone half the year and exhausted the other half. His mother did what she could, which was considerable, but what she could was always running against the edge of what was possible. Cole had learned early that the world didn't hold still for you while you sorted yourself out. You moved or you got left behind. He joined the Navy at 18 not because it was a dream, but because it was a door, and he was good at walking through doors that other people found heavy. He turned out to be good at a great many things that the SEAL training program needed men to be good at. Not because he was exceptional by nature, but because he'd already spent 18 years practicing the most essential skill in that world, managing fear while continuing to function. He served for 11 years. He did things in those 11 years that he did not talk about and had stopped allowing himself to think about in detail. Not because they were shameful, mostly they weren't, but because memory was a door that swung both ways, and some rooms you learned to keep locked not out of guilt, but out of simple self-preservation. He met Rachel in the way he met most things, sideways, without meaning to. She was a physical therapist at the clinic near the base in Virginia Beach, assigned to his knee rehabilitation after a training injury, and she had the particular gift of saying exactly what she meant without weaponizing it. He found her directness disarming in a way he hadn't expected. They were married 14 months later. He was 29. She was 27. Maisie came when he was 30, a colicky, furious infant who screamed at the ceiling for 3 months straight and then, seemingly overnight, became the most observant and eerily calm toddler either of them had ever seen. Rachel said Maisie got the screaming out early so she didn't have to bother with it later. Cole suspected she got it from him. Rachel got sick when Maisie was 4. It started with fatigue she thought was just the accumulated weight of motherhood and a demanding job, and by the time they had a name for it, the name wasn't a good one. Cole submitted his separation papers within a week of the diagnosis. 11 years of service, 4 deployments, a career he'd built from nothing, ended with a signature. He did not regret it. He would make the same decision 10,000 times and never pause. Rachel died when Maisie was 5.5. A Tuesday morning in November, with the light coming through the hospital window in that particular way it does in autumn, thin and slanted, and Maisie asleep in the chair in the corner because she'd refused to leave the night before. Cole had been holding Rachel's hand. He'd been holding it for so long his arm had gone half numb, and he hadn't moved. After, he took Maisie home and made her oatmeal because it was morning and children needed to eat, and she sat at the kitchen table and stirred the oatmeal in circles and finally said, without looking up, "Is she still there? Or is she all the way gone now?" "All the way gone," Cole had said, because he didn't believe in lying to her about hard things. Maisie had nodded. She'd eaten her oatmeal. She'd gone to her room and come back 10 minutes later with a drawing she'd made of the 3 of them at the park, holding hands, which she placed on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a fish. "So we remember," she'd said. "So we remember," Cole had agreed. He'd relocated them from Virginia to the city 8 months after Rachel died, chasing a job lead that fell through 2 weeks after they arrived. He found other work, more work. The kind of work that kept the lights on without requiring him to explain gaps in his resume or navigate the particular condescension of hiring managers who looked at a former special operations veteran and couldn't figure out where to put him. He was not bitter about any of it. Or rather, he was occasionally in the way you're bitter about weather. It was real, and it passed, and being angry at it didn't change it. What he was, mostly, was tired. The morning after the diner, he got back to Mrs. Peralta's house at 6:20 a.m., let himself in with the spare keys she'd given him, and found Maisie already up, sitting on the kitchen floor in her socks with a bowl of cereal, watching something on the small television Mrs. Peralta kept on the counter. "You're early," Maisie said. "6:20 isn't early," Cole said. "Mrs. Peralta says before 7 is early." Maisie looked at him with the particular alertness of a child who has made a habit of reading her parent's face. "You look tired." "I'm always tired." "Tired like that," Maisie said, in the tone that meant specifically this kind of tired, different from the usual kind. He sat down on the floor beside her. She leaned against his arm without making a production of it, just settled there, the way she did, like a plant finding the sun. "Something happened at the diner last night," he said, because he decided years ago that the right amount of truth was better than a managed silence. "Something bad?" "A man was bothering of the waitresses. I told him to stop." Maisie was quiet for a moment, eating her cereal. "Did he stop?" "Eventually." "Were there a lot of people watching who didn't say anything?" Cole looked at her. "Yeah, there were." She nodded with the solemnity of a 7-year-old who had already developed opinions about the world. "That's the thing that makes me feel weird," she said, "when people just watch." "Me too," Cole said. She ate her cereal. He sat on the kitchen floor with his jacket still on, and outside the window the city was beginning to lighten into the gray-blue of early morning, and he was tired in the way that only fathers know, the kind that lives behind the eyes and never fully leaves because some part of you is always awake. He didn't know then that the video was already spreading. He didn't know about the edited version, cut to begin in the middle, stripped of context, reframed by someone who understood how stories could be bent without technically being broken. He didn't know that his face was already on screens across the city, attached to a narrative he had no part in writing. He sat on Mrs. Peralta's kitchen floor and watched the sky go pale. Maisie finished her cereal, set the bowl aside, and leaned her head fully against his shoulder. "Thanks for always saying something, Dad," she said. He put his arm around her. Outside, the morning came up cold and quiet, the way mornings in this city always did, indifferent to what had just ended and what was already beginning. The video had been online for 6 hours before Cole even knew it existed. He found out the way he found out most things that mattered. From someone else, too late. I was halfway through his morning, sitting in the small kitchen of their apartment on Delancey Street, eating toast over the sink because the table had become a homework station and he hadn't bothered clearing it, when his phone rang. It was Marcus Webb, his supervisor at the warehouse on Kemper Road. Marcus was a decent man, the kind of supervisor who remembered your name and didn't manufacture reasons to write people up. Cole had always liked him. "Cole." Marcus's voice was careful, the particular careful of a man delivering something he didn't want to deliver. "I need you to come in." "I'm not scheduled until Thursday," Cole said. "I know. This isn't about a shift." Cole put down his toast. "Say it straight, Marcus." A pause. "There's a video, online. Look, it's going around. A lot of people have seen it. HR called me this morning, and I've been told I have to..." Another pause. "I'm sorry, Cole, I genuinely am, but until this gets sorted out, we're putting you on administrative leave." Which means I'm fired," Cole said. "It means leave, pending review." "Marcus." "I'm sorry," Marcus said again, and he sounded like he meant it, which somehow made it worse. Cole hung up and looked at his phone for a moment, then opened the browser. He found the video inside 30 seconds. It had a headline over it already, the kind that got written fast and shared faster. "Violent Veteran Attacks Businessman and Security Team in Local Diner." There was a thumbnail, a still frame, carefully chosen, that showed Cole mid-movement with one of Damien's men going down in front of him. Out of context, without the 10 seconds preceding it, without the hand on the waitress's wrist, without any of the actual sequence of events, it looked like exactly what the headline said it was. He watched the video. It started 14 seconds into the confrontation. 14 seconds, which was, he knew precisely, after Damien had grabbed the waitress, after Cole had walked to the counter, after both de-escalation requests that had been ignored. The edited version began at the moment Cole moved, which made him the aggressor in every frame that followed. Whoever had cut it knew what they were doing. They'd left enough in to make it look like raw footage, unsteady camera, ambient noise, while removing the only context that would have explained anything. He watched it twice. Then he set his phone face down on the counter. Maisie was at school. She'd be there until 3:15. He had until 3:15 to figure out what that meant. By noon, the Westgate Security Company had called. His overnight access credentials had been suspended while they reviewed the situation. By 1 in the afternoon, the landscaping company he picked up weekend work with had sent a text. 3 words. Don't come Saturday. By 2, his downstairs neighbor, a retired school teacher named Mr. Foreman, who'd always nodded politely in the hallway, passed him on the stairs without making eye contact. Cole stood in his apartment and did what he'd learned to do in the worst moments of his life. He took inventory. 3 jobs, gone, or suspended. Rent due in 11 days. Electric bill already late. Maisie's coat, the one with the broken zipper, hanging by the door. $163 in his checking account. A daughter who would be home in 2 hours and 20 minutes. He made a list on the back of an envelope. Things he could do, things he couldn't. He'd learned in the SEAL teams that panic was almost always a resource problem. You panicked when you believed you had fewer options than you actually had. The exercise of listing options, even bad ones, had a way of quieting the noise. He was halfway through the list when his buzzer rang. He pressed the intercom. Yeah. Mr. Maddox. A woman's voice, clear, controlled, with the faint edge of someone who was used to being the most composed person in any given room and was working to maintain that now. My name is Victoria Hale. I was at the diner last night. I'd like to speak with you. Cole didn't say anything for a moment. Please, she added, just the one word. Not pleading, more like someone acknowledging they didn't have any leverage here and weren't going to pretend otherwise. He buzzed her up. She came in wearing a dark coat that she'd clearly put on in a hurry, an expression that moved in a way expensive training usually prevented. She was 30 or so, dark-eyed, with the kind of self-possession that looked practiced until you noticed the edge of something real underneath it. She was carrying a phone and she was angry. Not at him, he could tell that immediately. At something else. Possibly at herself. I owe you an explanation, she said without waiting. You were the waitress, Cole said. She didn't flinch from it. Yes. The uniform was real. The work was real. He said it as a statement, not an accusation. Just laying out what he'd already worked through. All of it was real, she said. I've been working shifts at 3 different service jobs for the past 6 weeks. It's part of It doesn't matter right now. What matters is that what happened last night was because of who I am, and you're the one paying for it, and that's not acceptable. Who are you? Cole asked, though some part of him had already guessed. The way Damien Cross had looked at her, specifically, with the kind of focused anger that came from something personal rather than opportunistic. Victoria Hale, she said. Hale Dynamics. He knew the name. Everyone in the city knew the name. Hale Dynamics was technology, real estate, a dozen subsidiary companies. The kind of name that appeared on the sides of buildings. CEO, she added, when he didn't say anything. Since my father stepped back 18 months ago. Cole looked at her. Why were you working in a diner? I wanted to understand what our employees deal with. Firsthand, without anyone cleaning it up for me. She said it without embarrassment, which he respected. I've been doing it quietly. Different places, different shifts. Damien Cross, he's an investor. An old contact of my father's. He'd been pressuring me about a business arrangement I'd turned down twice. He found out where I was working that night and came to make a point. Her jaw tightened slightly. That's what the grab was. A point. Cole said nothing. I can fix this, Victoria said. The video, the jobs, all of it. I have attorneys, I have people I can make calls today and have this corrected by tomorrow morning. No, Cole said. She blinked. Mr. Maddox. No, he said again. Same tone he'd used in the diner. Flat, final. I appreciate that you came here. I do. But I'm not interested in having my situation fixed by a phone call from someone with the right last name. That's not justice. That's just a different version of the same problem. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. He could see her recalibrating, the expression of someone who'd prepared for several responses and hadn't prepared for this one. You understand what you're up against, she said carefully. Damien Cross has resources that… I understand, Cole said. I've been up against things with more resources than me before. She studied him. You're not scared. I didn't say that. Something shifted in her face. Not sympathy. She had the sense not to offer sympathy to a man who hadn't asked for it. More like a recalibration of something she'd assumed. Then what do you want? She asked. Right now? For you to tell me everything you know about Damien Cross. Cole moved toward the kitchen table, pulled Maisie's homework to one side, and sat down. And then I want to know why a man with 4 bodyguards drove to a diner on Harlow Street at 9 on a Wednesday night, just to make a point. Victoria sat down across from him. And she started talking. She talked for nearly an hour. Cole listened the way he'd been trained to listen, not just to the words, but to the spaces between them, the things she circled around, the moments where her voice changed register. What emerged was more complicated than the version that fit on a headline. Damien Cross was not simply a wealthy man with a temper. He was a man who had spent decades perfecting the particular art of consequence-free behavior, building a reputation just good enough to survive any individual accusation, while ensuring that the system around him was so thoroughly saturated with his money and influence that challenges simply dissolved before they could gain traction. There had been women before, more than a few. Victoria named 2 who'd filed formal complaints that had been quietly settled. She named a third who'd attempted to go public and found herself suddenly unemployable across an entire industry within 60 days. She said this with a controlled fury that Cole recognized as the particular anger of someone who'd watched something wrong happen and had been unable to stop it. I should have said something sooner, she said. I had information and I didn't use it because… She stopped. Because using it would have cost you something, Cole said. She looked at him. Yes. That's how it usually works, he said. Not judging, just stating. She nodded once, the nod of someone accepting a fair assessment they don't enjoy. It was 3:10. Cole stood up. I have to get my daughter. Victoria stood too. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a card, then stopped herself and set it on the table instead of handing it across, which told him she'd picked up something about how he operated. My direct number, not the office line. Cole looked at the card but didn't pick it up. You said you want to fix this. I do. Then find out who edited that video and document the chain of custody. Don't use private investigators who work for your company. Get someone outside your network, someone Cross doesn't have a line on, and find out if there are other witnesses in that diner who have unedited footage on their phones. People take videos of everything. He picked up his jacket. Don't do anything with whatever you find until I know what you've found. Victoria looked at him steadily. You're telling me how to run this. I'm telling you what actually helps, Cole said. Those are different things. He left to get Maisie. The walk to Mrs. Peralta's was 12 minutes. Cole walked it at his normal pace, hands in his pockets, watching the street with the reflex he'd never been able to switch off. The city moved around him the way cities always did. Indifferent, busy, full of lives running on their own rails. He passed a newsstand and saw his face on a tablet propped in the window, playing a news segment he couldn't hear through the glass. He kept walking. Maisie was sitting on Mrs. Peralta's front step when he arrived, backpack on her lap, and he knew from 30 feet away that something had happened. She had the particular stillness of a child who'd decided to be very quiet because being very quiet was the only protection currently available. He sat down on the step beside her. You want to tell me? He said. Maisie picked at a loose thread on her backpack strap. Cody Renner said his dad said you were on TV. He said you beat up innocent people. Do you believe that? She shook her head immediately, without hesitation, which settled something in his chest. What did you say to Cody Renner? Cole asked. I said his dad should watch the whole video. Cole looked at his daughter, 7 years old, defending him on a school step with the exact correct argument and no hesitation. He felt something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite grief and lived, as most complicated feelings did, somewhere in the middle of his sternum. Some other kids were weird about it too, Maisie said, quieter now. At lunch. They didn't say anything, but they were, I know, Cole said. Is it going to be bad for a while? He thought about lying. He thought about the careful, soft version of the answer that would get her through the afternoon without worry. He thought about the envelope on his kitchen counter with the list of options, and the $163, and the broken zipper on her coat. Probably yeah, he said, for a while. She nodded, slowly. Then she leaned into his side the way she did, the way she'd done since she was small enough to fit in the crook of his arm, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on Mrs. Peralta's step in the fading afternoon light. "We've done hard before," Maisie said. "We have," Cole said. "We were okay." "We were." She stood up, adjusted her backpack, and held out her hand so he could walk her home. The next 3 days were the worst kind of bad. Not dramatic, just grinding. Constant and low and everywhere. The video had been picked up by 2 television networks, one of which ran a segment called Veteran Violence, Who is Cole Maddox, with a graphic that included his military service record, which was publicly available, framed as though the words "Special Operations" were themselves a reason for suspicion. A cable news commentator spent 4 minutes suggesting that men with Cole's training were by nature predisposed to overreaction in civilian situations, and used the phrase "ticking time bomb" twice, which someone then clipped and shared separately, which meant the phrase attached itself to Cole's name across a completely different audience. He didn't watch it. Maisie wasn't exposed to it. He made sure of that, checking her tablet's history at night with the practiced casualness of a father who'd decided surveillance without honesty wasn't something he was willing to do, so he told her plainly, "I'm checking because I want to know what you're seeing, not because I don't trust you." She'd handed it over without argument. What he did watch, on the 4th morning, was a call from an unknown number that turned out to be an attorney. "Mr. Maddox, my name is Rebecca Quinn. I'm an attorney specializing in defamation, civil rights, and corporate malfeasance. Victoria Hale retained me 3 days ago. I'd like to meet with you." "She didn't mention hiring an attorney," Cole said. "She hired me after your conversation, based on your suggestion that she build a case outside her existing network." A brief pause. "You told her to find someone Damian Cross didn't have a line on. I'm that person. I've litigated against cross-affiliated entities twice. I'm the last attorney in this city he'd have expected her to call." Cole turned this over. "Why are you calling me instead of just working the case?" "Because you're a material witness, and because what I've found in 4 days suggests this is significantly larger than one diner incident, and because," a slight shift in her voice, not softer exactly, but more direct, "because you lost 3 jobs defending a woman from assault, and you're doing it without complaint and without any apparent plan to leverage it. And I find that either extraordinary or very suspicious, and I want to find out which." "Could be both," Cole said. "Could be," Rebecca Quinn agreed. "That's why I want to meet." They met the following afternoon at a coffee shop on the east side of the city that Rebecca had chosen, she explained, because it had no security cameras and its owner had a documented antagonism toward Damian Cross's real estate holdings, which had tried to buy out his building twice. She was in her mid-40s, compact and precise in her movements, with the particular brand of alertness that came from spending years in rooms where every word was on the record. She shook Cole's hand and got directly to work. "I've identified 7 women," she said, spreading nothing on the table. All of it was in her head, which he noticed. 7 who had formal or semi-formal contact with Damian Cross over the past 11 years, that resulted in either a settlement, a signed NDA, or a demonstrable pattern of professional retaliation. 2 of those women I've already spoken with. They won't testify. Not yet. She said yet with the particular weight of a person who hadn't accepted no as a final answer. "I've also obtained the original security system footage from the diner, the full recording, not the edited version, through a subpoena I filed under a separate harassment claim. Cross's attorneys will try to challenge the subpoena, but they won't succeed." Cole listened. "The original footage shows the whole sequence. Every second of it, including the grab, including your 2 requests that he release her, and—" She paused, and for the first time something that might have been dark. Amusement crossed her face, including the moment when 2 of his men made the choice to initiate physical contact with you, which, given what followed, is going to make for very clarifying viewing. "He'll know you have it," Cole said. "He already suspects. We have to move faster than his legal team can build a countermeasure." She looked at him directly. "Here's what I need to know. Is there anything in your background, military record, personal history, anything, that Cross could use to muddy the picture? I need to know before he does. Cole thought about this seriously, the way he thought about things he'd been asked to be honest about. My separation from the SEAL teams was honorable. My record is clean. There's nothing criminal. He stopped. Say it, Rebecca said. After my wife died, I went through about 4 months where I wasn't handling it well. I didn't do anything that got documented, but I was drinking more than I should have been, and there were some nights where I didn't. He stopped again. Where I wasn't the father I should have been. Nobody called anyone, nothing on paper. But if Cross has people looking, Rebecca nodded slowly. He can't use undocumented behavior in court, but he can leak it, strategically, to the same networks that are already running the story. She looked at him steadily. Are there people who witnessed that period who might talk? Mrs. Peralta, Cole said. My neighbor. She was the one who helped with Maisie during that time. She's the one who... She knocked on my door one night and said she was taking Maisie for a sleepover and I should sleep. That was it. That was all it took. Would she lie for you if asked? I wouldn't ask her to, Cole said. Would she tell the truth about that period? Mrs. Peralta, Cole said slowly, would describe that time as a father who was drowning in grief learning to swim. That's how she actually sees it. I know because she told me. Rebecca Quinn wrote something on the small notepad she'd produced. Then she's a character witness, not a liability. She looked up. Victoria wants to meet with both of us tomorrow. Are you willing? Cole thought about the list on the back of the envelope. The $163. The electric bill. Maisie's coat. He thought about the waitress in the pale blue uniform who hadn't been a waitress, and the 7 women Rebecca had named without naming, and the man in the charcoal suit who'd driven to a diner on Harlow Street to make a point because he'd decided he was the kind of man who got to do that. Yeah, Cole said. I'm willing. He paid for his own coffee on the way out, which he could barely afford, and walked back to Delancey Street in the late afternoon cold with his hands in his pockets, thinking about 11 seconds and what they'd cost him, and whether the cost was going to turn out to be the thing that mattered or just the beginning of the thing that mattered. He wasn't sure yet. He was usually better at knowing which kind of hard he was in. By the time he reached his building, his phone had buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. No name, just a message. 4 words. Back off or else. He looked at it for a moment. Then he screenshotted it and forwarded it to Rebecca Quinn's number. Then he went upstairs to make dinner for Maisie because it was 6 o'clock and she needed to eat, and there were some things that didn't stop mattering just because other things were happening. She wanted pasta, which was cheap and fast, and covered in the kind of cheese that came in a green container and was not strictly speaking cheese, but which Maisie had been devoted to since she was 4. He made it. They ate at the kitchen table with Maisie's homework pushed to one side, and she told him about a project on ecosystems she was doing with a girl named Priya, who she'd described as serious about it in a good way. And he listened to every word. He washed the dishes. He checked her tablet. He sat on the edge of her bed while she fell asleep, the way he'd done since Rachel died. Not every night, just the nights when the apartment felt too quiet in the wrong way. When her breathing evened out, he went to the kitchen, turned on the small lamp over the sink, and looked at the list on the back of the envelope. Then he turned it over and started writing a new one. Not options this time. Names, sequence, what he knew, what he needed to know. What Rebecca had told him and what Victoria hadn't said, and what the 4-word text implied about how afraid Damien Cross actually was of a single diner incident evolving into something he couldn't control. A man who was fully in control didn't send 4-word texts at 6 in the evening. Cole wrote until the lamp started flickering. The electricity, which had been stuttering for days. He looked at it. It stabilized. He kept writing. He was not a man who gave up ground easily. That had been true in the teams, and it had been true in the 4 months after Rachel died when he'd found his way back from somewhere he didn't like to look at directly, and it was true now. He did not romanticize stubbornness. He'd seen too many men confuse it with strategy. But there was a line between the two, and he knew where it was for him, and he hadn't crossed it yet. Damien Cross had 4 bodyguards, a legal team, and 11 years of practice making problems disappear. He had a city full of people who owed him something, and media contacts who'd run a story the way he handed it to them, and enough money that most obstacles became eventually just a number to be agreed on. What he didn't have, and what Cole was beginning to understand was the actual shape of this problem, was the original footage, or Rebecca Quinn, Or 7 women who were still out there, still carrying what they knew, still waiting for the moment when it might be safe enough to say it out loud. Cole folded the envelope, put it in his jacket pocket, turned off the flickering lamp. He stood in the dark kitchen and listened to the city outside. Traffic, a dog somewhere, someone's music 2 floors up bleeding thin through the ceiling. The ordinary sound of a place going on with itself. He went to bed. He set his alarm for 5:30. Tomorrow he'd meet with Victoria Hale and Rebecca Quinn, and they'd figure out what came next. Tonight, he was a tired man with a daughter asleep in the next room, and the city didn't stop making noise for either of those facts. And that was all right. He'd never needed it to. The meeting the next morning was at Victoria's office, which was not the Hale Dynamics Tower downtown, but a smaller building she kept separately. A converted warehouse space in the Meridian district that her assistant described as her working office, as opposed, Cole gathered, to her performing office. The distinction said something about her that he filed away without comment. Rebecca was already there when Cole arrived, sitting at a long table with 3 open folders and a coffee she hadn't touched. Victoria was standing at the window with her back to the room, looking at the street below in the way people look at things they're not actually seeing. She turned when Cole came in, and he noticed she looked like she'd slept badly, which was a more human detail than he'd expected from her. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You have anything new?" Cole asked, because pleasantries weren't something any of them had time for. Victoria and Rebecca exchanged a glance. Rebecca spoke first. 2 things. The subpoena on the original footage is holding. Cross's legal team filed a challenge yesterday afternoon, but the judge assigned to the motion is someone Cross has never donated to, never socialized with, and has a documented record of ruling against delay tactics in civil cases. She paused. The footage will be authenticated and admissible within the week, barring something I'm not currently anticipating. And the second thing, Cole said. Victoria turned from the window. He had someone follow Maisie to school yesterday. The room went very quiet. Cole sat with that for a moment. He kept his face still. Not because he didn't feel it, but because feeling it loudly in this room wouldn't accomplish anything useful. He breathed in once, out once. "You're sure?" he said. "One of my security staff spotted a man parked outside her school for 2 hours. He didn't approach her. He didn't do anything. He just sat and watched." Victoria's voice was controlled, but her hands, Cole noticed, were not entirely. She had them pressed flat on the table. "I had photos taken. Rebecca has them." Rebecca slid a folder across the table. Cole opened it. A man in a dark sedan, nondescript, parked 40 feet from the school gate. Long lens shots. Good clarity. Cole studied the face. He didn't know it, but he memorized it the way he'd memorized faces in other contexts, in other years for other reasons. He closed the folder, set it back on the table. "This is what escalation looks like," he said. Not to either of them in particular. More to himself. He's not trying to win in court anymore. He's trying to make us stop before it gets there. "That's my read," Rebecca said. "Mine too," said Victoria. She sat down across from Cole. "I want to increase your security. I have people who can—" "No," Cole said. "Cole, if his people see your security people around me, it tells him he's getting to us. It tells him the pressure is working." Cole looked at her steadily. "Right now, the only advantage we have is that he doesn't know how we're going to respond. The moment he sees a reaction, we lose that." Victoria stared at him. He could see her working through it, the logic of it against the instinct of it. She was not a person who found it easy to do nothing when something needed doing. He understood that. He had the same problem. "Maisie," she said. "I'll handle Maisie," Cole said. What handling Maisie meant, practically, was a conversation he'd been dreading and couldn't avoid. He picked her up from school himself that afternoon, which he didn't always do. Usually she rode the bus to Mrs. Peralta's on his work days. He watched the street the entire walk home without appearing to. The dark sedan wasn't there. Different car maybe, or they'd pulled back after being photographed. Either way, he didn't relax. In the apartment, after she'd had a snack and started her homework, he sat down at the table with her. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to not get scared because there's nothing happening that I can't handle, okay?" Maisie looked up from her worksheet. She had Rachel's eyes, dark brown, very direct. "Okay," she said, in the tone that meant she was already bracing. "Some people who work for the man from the diner have been watching your school, just watching, not coming near you. But I want you to know, so that if you ever see someone paying attention to you in a way that feels wrong, you tell a teacher immediately, and you call me." Maisie was quiet for a moment. Her pencil turned slowly in her fingers. "Because of what you did." "Because of what I did," Cole said. "And because I'm not going to pretend it's not happening. You're old enough to know." "I'm 7, she said. 7 is old enough, he said. "You've handled harder things." She looked at her worksheet, then she looked back at him. "Are you scared?" "A little," he said. "Mostly I'm paying attention. Those are different things." "Priya's brother is in middle school," Maisie said, with the apparent non sequitur that he'd learned always led somewhere. "He got in trouble once for pushing someone who was bothering Priya. His mom was mad at him, but Priya said she wasn't." Cole waited. "I'm not mad at you," Maisie said, "in case you were wondering." He reached across the table and put his hand briefly over hers. She went back to her worksheet. He made dinner. He checked the windows. He called Rebecca at 9 and asked for the photo of the man in the sedan to be run through every database she had access to. She said she was already on it. He asked her to also find out who owned the specific vehicle and trace it back as far as it would go. She said the same. He asked if she'd heard from any of the 7 women. A pause. "One," she said. "I'm not going to use her name yet because she hasn't agreed to anything. But she reached out to me, which means the news coverage is reaching people we didn't directly contact." Another pause. "It's slow, Cole. I know it feels slow." "It's fine," he said. "Slow is how it works when you're doing it right." He didn't sleep well. He hadn't slept well since the diner, but the photograph of Maisie's school had replaced the electric bill as the thing his brain returned to in the dark. He lay on his back and ran through options the way he'd been trained to. Not worrying exactly, but threat mapping. The disciplined habit of accounting for what could happen before it happened, so that if it did, the response was already formed. He went over the layout of Maisie's school, the 4 access points, the 2 streets that dead-ended near the playground, the staff he'd spoken with during enrollment, the principal, who seemed capable, a security guard named Wilson, who'd struck him as alert. He composed a message to the principal in his head, the kind that communicated concern without triggering panic, that requested additional monitoring without requiring explanations he wasn't ready to give publicly. He sent it at 6 in the morning when his alarm went off and had a response by 7:15. The principal's name was Diane Foster, and she'd been running schools for 22 years, which apparently meant she'd seen enough to read between lines efficiently. Her response was 4 sentences. She understood, she'd spoken with Wilson, there would be 2 staff members at each entrance during arrival and dismissal, and if Cole needed to speak further, she was available at any time. No questions. No drama. He was unexpectedly grateful. The days that followed built on each other in the way that difficult periods do, each one adding weight to the last, the accumulation more wearing than any individual day. The anonymous text continued, a total of 7 over 2 weeks, varying in specificity and tone, which Rebecca documented and forwarded to law enforcement contacts she trusted. None of them named Maisie directly. They were careful in that way, careful enough to stay in legal gray areas. But their existence established a pattern, and patterns were evidence. Cole's former employer at the Westgate Security Company called on the 10th day, not Marcus but someone from HR, to confirm the termination was now formal rather than a suspension. The call was scripted and bloodless. Cole thanked the person for letting him know and hung up without discussing it further. Money was becoming a concrete problem. The $163 had become $47. He'd sold a watch, his father's, which he'd worn for 12 years, a battered stainless steel thing worth maybe $200 to a pawn shop that gave him $120, and he'd borrowed $300 from an army friend in Baltimore named Garrett, who transferred the money without being asked what it was for. Cole had texted back, "I'll pay you back." Garrett had replied, "Whenever." That was the whole conversation, which was the right amount. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself this with the same deliberateness he applied to everything. Not optimism, which he'd never trusted, but the tactical assessment that a situation was fluid rather than fixed. It helped, most days. Some days it didn't help at all, and he ate cereal for dinner after Maisie was in bed because the cereal was already bought and he wasn't hungry anyway. Victoria called twice during that period, the first time to update him on the footage authentication, which was progressing. The second time she started to speak and then stopped, and after a moment said, How are you actually doing? He considered several answers. I'm managing, he said, which was true, and also the simplest version of a more complicated answer. I know that's not what I asked, she said. He looked at the $47 showing on his banking app, which was open on the table in front of him. The money situation is tight, he said, because lying about it felt pointless, and she was going to find out eventually, in any case. A silence. He could feel her restraining herself from offering to fix it. Okay, she said finally. Okay, he said. I just wanted to know, she said. Not to do anything about it, just to know. He thought about that after he hung up. The distinction she'd drawn, the effort it had clearly taken not to collapse it. He found he respected her more for having made it. The breakthrough on the man in the sedan came on the 14th day. Rebecca called at 11 in the morning, which was unusual because she typically communicated in the evenings when she'd had time to compile everything. The fact that she was calling mid-morning meant she had something she didn't want to sit on. The vehicle is registered to a property management company called Delos Holdings, she said without preamble. Delos Holdings is a subsidiary of a shell company called Arch River Group. Arch River Group, if you follow the ownership chain through 3 additional entities in 2 different states, connects to an investment vehicle controlled by Damian Cross. She said it the way you say something you want the other person to fully absorb before continuing. He used company infrastructure to conduct personal surveillance of a 7-year-old. Cole sat down. The man in the car, he said. Former private investigator, licensed in 2 states, currently operating informally. He has 2 prior complaints against him for surveillance misconduct, both settled before they became formal charges. We have his name, his address, and another pause. He kept records, digital records, which were poorly secured. Rebecca did not explain how she had accessed them, and Cole did not ask. What kind of records? A log of Maisie's school schedule, her usual arrival and departure times, the names of 2 children she regularly interacts with during recess. Rebecca's voice, usually precise to the point of being almost clinical, had something in it that he recognized as controlled anger. It was a pressure file, something to hold over you, to make you understand that they could reach her if they chose to. Cole sat in his kitchen with the phone against his ear and the $47 on his banking app and the watch he no longer had on his wrist, and he felt something move through him that was not fear. He'd been past fear since the second anonymous text, but something colder and more clarifying. The specific internal shift of a man who has been operating defensively and has just identified the precise moment when that has to change. Send everything to law enforcement, he said. Use your contacts, whoever you trust most, and make sure there's a copy stored somewhere that isn't connected to any of our names. Already done on both, Rebecca said. The man in the sedan, is he still active? I don't believe so. I think he was spooked when he realized he'd been photographed. But I can't confirm. Keep monitoring. Cole stood up and walked to Maisie's bedroom door. She was at school, the room was empty, but he stood in the doorway anyway for a moment. Her drawing of the 3 of them was on the wall above her bed, the one from the refrigerator that she'd moved when they relocated. Stick figures, bright crayon, all holding hands. Rebecca, the 7 women, where are we? 3 have made contact now, she said. 2 are still refusing direct engagement. The 3rd, the one who reached out first. She came in person last Thursday. A pause. Her name is Sandra Cho. She was a financial analyst at a firm Cross held a stake in. She left that firm under circumstances that look very different from how they were officially described. Another pause. Longer. She kept everything, Cole. Emails, recordings, a contemporaneous journal she kept on a personal device that was never part of the company network. 11 months of documentation. Cole leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. That's not just a witness. No, Rebecca said. That's a case. The shift in tempo after that was hard to describe to someone who hadn't experienced it. The way a thing that has been very slow and grinding suddenly begins to gather its own momentum, like a car that's been pushed uphill finally cresting the ridge. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt precarious, the way momentum always does when you're the one responsible for it. Rebecca filed a formal complaint with the state attorney's office on Sandra Cho's behalf, citing the private investigator's surveillance log as evidence of a pattern of intimidation connected to Damian Cross's business operations. She was careful. Cole had come to understand that carefulness was Rebecca Quinn's primary instrument, the thing she wielded with the precision other attorneys applied to rhetoric. She filed in a way that couldn't be quietly redirected. She filed in a way that created a paper record that existed in multiple places simultaneously, so that making it disappear would require making it disappear in at least 4 locations at once, which was no longer a practical option. Cross's attorneys filed 3 counter motions within 48 hours. Rebecca had expected 2 of them and had prepared responses in advance. The third was more creative, a defamation claim against Cole personally, arguing that his presence at the meeting with Rebecca and Victoria constituted deliberate collusion to damage Cross's reputation. It was a thin claim, built to cost rather than win, designed to attach legal expenses to Cole's name in a situation where he had $47. Cole read it, set it down, picked up his phone and called Victoria. "He's filing against me personally," he said. "I know, Rebecca called me." A pause. "Cole, let me cover the legal defense costs, not as a favor, as Victoria, as a necessary operational expense for the case, because your defense and the broader case are directly linked and Victoria." She stopped. "I'm not going to win this thing and then spend the next 5 years feeling like I owe it to someone else's money," he said. "You understand the difference between those two things." A long silence. "Then what do you want me to do?" "Nothing yet," he said. "Let Rebecca work the counter. If it gets to a point where it's genuinely untenable, I'll tell you." He paused. "That's me trusting you with information I'd rather not share. That should mean something." Another silence, this one different in texture. "It does," she said. Rebecca's counter motion was filed within 24 hours and was, by her own description, precise. She did not explain precisely what that meant, but the counter motion, which Cole read in full, demonstrated that the defamation claim relied on a characterization of events that was directly contradicted by the original diner footage that was now authenticated and in the hands of the court. She also noted, in a footnote that managed to be both dry and devastating, that the plaintiff's own financial records showed payments to the private investigator whose surveillance log had been submitted as evidence to the state attorney's office, and that a defamation claim brought by a party currently under investigation for stalking and intimidation presented certain procedural complications that the court may wish to consider. The counter motion against Cole was withdrawn 4 days later. Nobody called to tell him. He found out from Rebecca in the same even-toned way she delivered most information, as a fact, without celebration, because there were still things ahead that required energy she wasn't going to spend on relief. What he didn't know, what was happening in a part of the story he wasn't present for, was Edward Hale. Victoria's father had been, by every account Cole had access to, a complicated figure. He'd built Hale Dynamics from a regional technology firm into something that operated on a genuinely international scale, which required a certain kind of ruthlessness that he'd never pretended he didn't possess. He'd handed the company to Victoria not because he was sentimental about succession, but because she was the best person for it, which was a decision that required him to admit she was better at it than he was, which was the hardest thing he'd ever done, and he had not entirely stopped second-guessing it. When the diner footage first circulated, Edward had been in London. His assistant had sent him the video and the coverage, and his first reaction had been the reaction of a man who processed the world through a specific lens. Who was this person? What did he want? And how much of this was a calculated maneuver targeting his daughter and, by extension, his company? He'd hired his own investigators. Not the kind that Damien Cross used. Edward's investigators were the expensive, discreet variety that large institutions used when they needed a true picture rather than a convenient one. He gave them 3 directives. Find out who Cole Maddox actually was, what his financial situation looked like, and whether there was any prior relationship, any at all, between Maddox and Victoria or Maddox and Hale Dynamics. The report came back in pieces over 2 weeks, and each piece complicated the theory he'd started with. Cole Maddox had no prior relationship with Victoria or the company. His financial records were a portrait of a man working at the edge of what was sustainable. 3 jobs, no savings worth speaking of, a medical debt from Rachel's final hospitalization that he'd been paying down in small installments for 2 years, and which he'd never contested or attempted to negotiate down. No lawsuits filed, no insurance fraud, no pattern of behavior that suggested someone building a strategy. His military record, which Edward's people obtained through channels that required several phone calls to people Edward had known for decades, was not the record of a man who'd left under any kind of cloud. It was the record of a man who'd left because his wife was dying, which was, as far as Edward could see, not a complicated thing to understand. The personal history, the 4 months after Rachel's death, the drinking, the nights Maisie had been kept by the neighbor. His investigators found reference to this period through interviews with people in their former building in Virginia. What they found matched, with depressing accuracy, the account of a man who had been broken by something real and who had found his way back to his feet through the particular mechanics of having a child who needed him too. No dramatic intervention, no facility, just the daily, grinding, unnarratable work of choosing to get up again. Edward read all of it. He read it in his study at the Hale estate on a Thursday evening with a glass of scotch he didn't finish, and when he was done, he sat for a long time without doing anything. He thought about a thing his wife, Victoria's mother, 7 years dead herself now, had once said to him in the middle of an argument he could no longer remember the specifics of, "You assume the worst of people you don't know because it protects you from being surprised. But it also means you're wrong a lot, and you never notice because you don't stay long enough to find out." He had not thought about that in years. He called his investigators back and added a directive. Find out what Cole Maddox currently needed. Not what he wanted, what he needed. The answer, which came back within 48 hours, was not surprising, and Edward sat with it and made no decision yet. He was a man who had made a career of not making decisions before he understood all of what a decision would cost him. He was also, though he would not have said this aloud to anyone, a man who occasionally recognized, late, always late, when his calculations had missed the thing that actually mattered. Back on Delancey Street, Cole was doing what he'd been doing throughout, the work. Not the dramatic work. There was no dramatic work to do yet. The daily, methodical, unglamorous work of a man who understood that most of what determined outcomes happened in the ordinary hours between the moments anyone would ever think to write about. He'd found a part-time night job at a copy and print shop on Wendell Avenue, which paid less than the warehouse and asked nothing of him physically beyond the ability to stand for 6 hours. He took it. He worked it. He came home. He made breakfast for Maisie. He called Rebecca. He sent Maisie to school. He called Rebecca again. The 4th woman contacted Rebecca on a Tuesday in the 3rd week, then the 5th, 2 days later, through a route that came not from the news coverage but from Sandra Cho, who had apparently been reaching out quietly through a network of professional contacts, women who had worked in or around Cross's financial orbit and who had been waiting, it turned out, not for certainty, but for company. The particular threshold that made coming forward feel survivable was not the strength of the evidence, but the knowledge that someone else was doing it too. Cole understood this. He'd seen the same dynamic in other contexts, the way courage worked in groups, how the first person who moved made room for the second, and the second made room for the rest. It was one of the things the teams had understood that most civilian institutions spent decades trying to learn. You didn't build courage by demanding it individually. You built the conditions where it became possible. I was thinking about this, standing in the copy shop on a slow Thursday night, watching the machine behind him work through a print job, when his phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca. The footage goes to the court Monday morning. Judge Okafor denied the 3rd delay motion. We're moving. He read it twice. Put his phone back in his apron pocket. Watched the machine finish its job and start on the next. The man at the counter, a heavy-set guy in his 60s, picking up flyers for a church rummage sale, looked at Cole and said, with the randomness of strangers who make conversation to fill silence, "You doing okay, son?" Cole looked at him. "Getting there," he said. The man nodded with the comfortable vagueness of someone who hadn't expected a real answer, and was satisfied with that one, and took his flyers and left. Cole turned back to the machine. Outside, through the plate glass window, the city was doing what it did. Moving, lit up, indifferent, full of people managing their own versions of hard. A bus went past. A woman jogged by in the cold. A kid on a bike ran the light at the corner and made it through fine. It was the kind of night that didn't know it was on the edge of something. Most nights were like that. Most things that changed the shape of what came after started in the ordinary hours, in the rooms where nothing appeared to be happening, where a man was just standing at a counter waiting for a machine to finish its work and thinking about what came next. Cole thought about what came next. He thought about 5 women who had kept records and kept silent for years, and who were now for the first time doing something different with what they knew. He thought about Rebecca, who had probably not slept a full night in 3 weeks, and who spoke about her work with the focused intensity of someone who had decided a long time ago what she was for. He thought about Victoria, who had walked into a diner in a gray uniform to understand something true about other people's lives, and had ended up in the middle of a fight she hadn't planned for and hadn't retreated from. He thought about Maisie, who had put their family drawing on the wall above her bed so they would remember. He thought about the man in the dark sedan who had sat outside a school for 2 hours to make a point about what fear could do. The machine finished the job. Cole pulled the copies out, stapled them, set them in the tray for pickup. He was not the kind of man who talked about being certain. He'd spent too many years in situations where certainty was the most dangerous thing you could carry. But there was something else, something quieter and harder to put a name to, that he felt in the copy shop on Wendell Avenue on that ordinary Thursday night. The sense that a thing had been building for a long time and was nearly built. The sense that what came next was no longer entirely in Damien Cross's hands. The sense, and this one he was careful with, because he'd been wrong before about exactly this kind of feeling, that the corner had been turned without anyone announcing it. He finished his shift at 2 in the morning. He walked home in the cold. He checked the windows, checked his phone, made sure the door was locked. Maisie was asleep. Her nightlight threw a small yellow circle on the wall beside her bed. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the way he did, and listened to her breathe. Then he went to bed, and this time, for the first time in 3 weeks, he slept without waking until the alarm. The footage reached the court on Monday morning exactly as Rebecca had promised, and by Monday afternoon it had done something none of them had fully anticipated. It leaked. Not through Rebecca, not through Victoria's office, not through anyone connected to their side of this. The leak came from inside the court's administrative processing system. A paralegal, it would later emerge, who had a sister who had worked at one of Cross's portfolio companies and who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this kind of moment. One copy, forwarded to a journalist at the city's oldest independent newspaper. The journalist, a 58-year-old woman named Carla Reyes, who had been covering financial crime for 2 decades and who recognized immediately what she was looking at, spent 6 hours verifying the footage's authenticity before she published anything. Then she published everything. The story ran at 11:17 on a Monday night. By Tuesday morning, it had been picked up by 14 other outlets. By Tuesday afternoon, the number was past 40. By Wednesday, it had traveled far enough that Rebecca got a call from a national news producer she'd worked with years before, and Victoria's communications director sent her a message that said simply, "We've lost control of the timeline." Cole found out on Tuesday morning when Maisie, eating her cereal at the kitchen table, looked up from the tablet she wasn't supposed to be on before school and said, "Dad, there's a different video now." He took the tablet. He watched the full original footage, his footage, the real one, play on the screen of a device his daughter used to watch nature documentaries. He watched himself walk to the counter. He watched himself ask twice. He watched Damien Cross's hand on the waitress's wrist, the angle of it, the deliberateness of it. He watched the whole 11 seconds from an angle he'd never seen before, from the diner's fixed camera above the register, which captured everything the handheld phone footage had been cut to exclude. He set the tablet down. "You really did ask him twice," Maisie said. "I did." She nodded with the gravity of someone who had been waiting to verify this personally. "Cody Renner is going to feel pretty bad," she said, and went back to her cereal. Cole called Rebecca at 7:30. She answered on the first ring, which told him she'd been awake. "I know," she said before he could speak. "I didn't authorize it." "I know you didn't," he said. "Is it a problem?" A pause in which he could hear her running through the legal and strategic implications in real time. "It complicates the court process slightly. It doesn't damage it. The footage is authenticated. The leak doesn't change what it shows." Another pause. "What it does change is the public situation, which was already shifting, but now it's—" She stopped. "Cole, his attorneys called me this morning. They want to discuss settlement terms." Cole was quiet for a moment. "For what? For which claim?" "All of them. They want a global settlement, a number, NDAs, and everyone walks away." "No," Cole said. "I told them you'd say that," Rebecca said, with something in her voice that might have been the very beginning of a smile. I told them you'd need to hear it from me directly, and that your answer would be no, but that we were willing to discuss the terms of what a full legal resolution would look like. Which is different from a settlement. Considerably different, she said. A settlement is a private arrangement. A full legal resolution involves courts, charges, and public record. His attorneys know the difference. They called anyway, which means they're scared, and scared people sometimes make the mistake of thinking the other side has the same appetite for exit that they do. We don't, Cole said. No, Rebecca said. We don't. The next 72 hours had the quality of a thing moving faster than anyone's ability to fully track it. 2 more women came forward, not through Rebecca directly, but through a victim advocacy organization that had contacted Sandra Cho after the story ran, adding their own documented accounts to a record that was becoming too large and too specific to be characterized as anything other than what it was. A state senator whose district included 3 of Cross's major development projects issued a statement calling for a formal investigation. Cross's largest institutional investor, a pension fund based in the Northeast, announced it was reviewing its position in cross-affiliated entities, which was the particular corporate language that meant money was already moving toward the door. Cross himself said nothing publicly. His publicist issued a 2-sentence statement calling the footage selectively interpreted and promising full cooperation with any legitimate inquiry, neither of which sentence was technically a lie, but both of which were the kind of language that, in the current climate, made things demonstrably worse. The statement was picked up and analyzed by 3 separate media commentators within hours, each of whom noted, with the particular enthusiasm of people who had been waiting a long time to note it, that selectively interpreted was a strange phrase to apply to footage that showed, in unbroken sequence, thing the original edited version had been cut to hide. Victoria was in the middle of all of it in a way that Cole observed mostly from a distance, through updates and brief calls. She was the public face. She'd made that choice deliberately, early, because she was the one with the platform and the name recognition, and because standing behind someone else's public battle when she was the person who'd been assaulted was not something she was willing to do. She gave 2 interviews that week. Both were direct and specific. In the first, she described the incident in the diner in language that was neither clinical nor dramatic, just precise, the way she seemed to do most things. In the second, she spoke about the Guardian Workplace Initiative, which she had been developing quietly for 3 weeks, in broad terms that suggested something concrete was coming without making promises she hadn't yet finalized. Cole watched the second interview on the small television in the copy shop on Wendell Avenue during a slow stretch on Thursday night. His coworker, a young man named Dev, who was 22 and studying graphic design at a community college, and who had been watching Cole with the curious, assessing attention of someone who knew something was different about this guy but hadn't figured out what yet, stood beside him and watched for a moment. "That's the Halo Dynamics lady," Dev said. "Yeah," Cole said. "She's good at talking," Dev said. "Like, you can tell she actually means it. That's rare." Cole looked at the screen. Victoria was mid-answer, and Dev was right. There was something about her that transmitted as genuine in a context where genuine was the rarest commodity available. She wasn't performing composure. She was composed, which was different, and the difference was visible to anyone paying attention. "Yeah," Cole said again. "She does." Dev looked at him sideways. "You know her?" A pause. "A little," Cole said. Dev accepted this and went back to the counter, and Cole stood in front of the television and watched the interview finish, and felt something he couldn't entirely name, the complicated mixture of being in the middle of something large, and also being, in this particular moment, a man in an apron in a copy shop watching it happen on a screen. The summons came on Friday. Not a legal summons, a request, which was technically different, but carried the same weight of something you didn't decline. It came through Rebecca, who called at 8 in the morning with a formality in her voice that she usually reserved for courts. "Edward Hale would like to meet with you," she said. Cole let this sit for a moment. "Does Victoria know?" "She does. She didn't arrange it, but she knows. He contacted me directly." A pause. "I've worked adjacent to Edward Hale for long enough to have an opinion about him. He's not a warm man, but he's not a dishonest one, which in this context is more important." "What does he want?" Cole asked. "He told me he wants to understand who you are," Rebecca said. I believe that's the accurate answer, even though it sounds incomplete. Cole met Edward Hale that afternoon at the Hale estate, not the corporate tower, not Victoria's working office, but the actual house, which was on the northern edge of the city where the streets widened and the trees were old enough to have seen several versions of the neighborhood come and go. The house was large without being theatrical about it, the kind of architecture that said money through quality rather than scale. A housekeeper let Cole in and took his jacket without looking at him with any particular expression, which he appreciated. Edward was in a room off the main hallway that appeared to function as a study. Books, a desk that had actual work on it rather than being decorative, a window looking out onto a garden that had gone dormant for the season. He was in his mid-60s, with the physical solidity of a man who had once been broader and had settled into a more considered version of himself. He did not stand when Cole entered, which Cole read not as rudeness, but as the behavior of a man who was watching how the other person entered a room. Cole entered the way he entered most rooms, without announcement. Edward looked at him for a moment. Then he stood and extended his hand. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You asked," Cole said. They shook hands. Cole sat in the chair across the desk without waiting to be directed to it, which was also, he suspected, something Edward was noting. Edward sat back down. He had a folder on the desk in front of him that Cole recognized, from the thickness and the tab markings, as an investigative report. He didn't open it. "I had you looked into," Edward said. Not apologetically, just as a fact. "I figured," Cole said. "My investigators are thorough," Edward said. "I've used them for 20 years. I trust their work." "Okay," Cole said. "They found nothing that suggests you're opportunistic. Nothing that suggests a prior angle on my daughter or my company. Nothing that suggests the incident in the diner was anything other than exactly what the footage shows." Edward said this the way a man reads a verdict. Not with emotion, just with the weight of something that has been decided. "They also found the period after your wife died." Cole didn't say anything. "I want you to know that I understand what that period represents," Edward said, and his voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but less constructed. "My wife died 7 years ago. I handled it." He paused, and for the first time, Cole saw something cross the older man's face that was genuinely unguarded. "I handled it very badly. I had advantages you didn't have, in terms of resources, and I still handled it badly. The difference between your situation and mine is that you had a 7-year-old who needed you to find your way back. I had adult children who could manage without me, which meant I had the luxury of staying lost longer than I should have." Cole looked at him. He hadn't expected this. He wasn't sure anyone would have expected this from Edward Hale. "I'm not telling you this so that you'll think better of me," Edward continued. "I'm telling you because my investigators presented me with a fact, that you went through something real and found your way out of it. And the least I can do is acknowledge that I understand what that costs." He straightened slightly. "I was wrong about you. I formed a judgment before I had the information to support it, and I was wrong. That's what I wanted to say first." Cole sat with this. He wasn't a man who was easily moved by apology. He'd heard too many apologies that were really negotiations, too many that were performances designed to create an obligation in the receiver. This one didn't feel like either of those things. It felt like a man who had sat alone with a report for several evenings and had arrived, the hard way, at something honest. "All right," Cole said. Edward nodded. "The second thing." He opened the folder and slid a single page across the desk. "Damian Cross's attorneys made a formal settlement offer to our legal team yesterday. They've expanded the offer to include a financial package for you personally. Significant. The number is on that page." Cole looked at the page. He looked at the number. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, and slid it back. Edward looked at him. "You understand that number would—" "I understand exactly what it would do," Cole said. "That's not the question." "Then what is the question?" "The question is what it would cost," Cole said. "An NDA. His name stays clean. The women who kept records for 11 years go back to keeping them in private because the only person who ever had enough standing to take this public just took a check instead." He paused. "I have $40 in my checking account, Mr. Hale. That number on that page is a real thing to me. I want to be clear that I understand exactly what I'm saying no to." Edward was quiet for a long time. "Why?" he said finally, not challenging, genuinely asking. Cole thought about how to say it without it sounding like a speech. He didn't have a great answer that was also a short one, so he went with the truest version. Because my daughter is going to spend the rest of her life in a world where people like Damian Cross do what they do and keep doing it, because the calculation always comes out in their favor. And I was in a position to change one of those calculations. I don't get to complain about the world and then take the check. Edward sat back. He looked at the page he'd slid back across the desk. I've spent 40 years in business, he said, and I've made a great number of decisions that I justified on exactly that kind of logic. The calculation, what it cost, what it returned. He paused. I've met very few people who refuse to do that math at all. I'm not refusing, Cole said. I did the math. It just came out different. Something moved in Edward's expression. Something that was not quite a smile and not quite its opposite. All right, Edward said. He closed the folder. Then let me tell you what I've been building in the other direction. What Edward had been building, it turned out, had been in progress for 10 days, quietly, through channels he'd been cultivating for decades. He'd been in contact with the state attorney's office independently of Rebecca, not to supplant her work, but to add institutional weight to it. He'd spoken with 4 board members of Cross's primary investment vehicle, not as a threat, but as the kind of conversation that old men with long memories have when they want to make clear that a reckoning is no longer avoidable. He'd also been in conversation with the leadership of Hale Dynamics' annual Global Technology Summit, which was scheduled for the following week, and which was, by any measure, the largest single-platform event the company ran each year. Thousands of attendees, live broadcast, the kind of stage that made whatever happened on it significant by virtue of the audience alone. Victoria is planning to use it, Edward said. The summit. She's been building toward a public announcement about the Guardian Workplace Initiative, and she's going to use the original footage as part of that announcement. She hasn't told me the full details of how. She's also, he added, with the particular expression of a father who has realized his child has grown past his ability to manage, not asking my permission. She shouldn't have to, Cole said. No, Edward agreed. She shouldn't. He looked at Cole. I want you there. At the summit. Not on stage. I'm not suggesting, good, Cole said, but present, as a witness. And because, Edward paused, and for a moment he looked his age in a way he probably rarely allowed. Because I think what's about to happen is going to be a significant thing, and the man who started it by standing up in a diner when everyone else was looking at their plates should be in the room when it finishes. Cole looked out the window at the dormant garden. A bird was working at something in the bare branches of a tree near the wall. A small, unremarkable bird doing unremarkable bird things, indifferent to everything else. I'll be there, Cole said. The summit was held the following Thursday at the Meridian Convention Center, a venue large enough that the scale of it was slightly disorienting if you weren't accustomed to spaces designed to make you feel small in a way you were supposed to interpret as inspiring. Cole arrived early, wearing the one suit he owned, dark navy, bought for Rachel's funeral and worn twice since, and was met by one of Victoria's staff who brought him to a seat in the 4th row of the main hall, slightly off-center, with a clear sight line to the stage and the 2 primary exits. Old habit. He sat there and watched the hall fill. There were thousands of them. Industry people, technology people, investors, journalists, a significant contingent of Hale Dynamics employees who'd been given tickets as part of what the company described as its annual culture initiative. The energy in the room was the particular energy of people who expected something impressive and were prepared to be pleased. The screens on either side of the stage cycled through the Hale Dynamics logo and promotional materials. The lighting was deliberate and flattering. Everything about the setup communicated, something significant is about to happen here. Which was true, though not in the way most of the room was anticipating. Cole saw Rebecca 2 rows ahead of him and to the left. She was in a dark jacket, sitting very still, with the particular stillness of someone who is coiled. He caught her eye briefly. She nodded once. He did not see Victoria until she walked onto the stage. She came out to the kind of applause that a room gives when it is genuinely glad to see someone, not the polite performing kind. She was in a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, and she stood at the podium for a moment and let the room settle. And when it settled, she did not begin where the program indicated she would begin. I want to show you something, she said, before we get into the agenda for today. The promotional materials disappeared from the screens. The lights shifted slightly. And then the footage began. Not a clip. Not an excerpt. The full original recording from the diner, from the moment Damian Cross walked in to the moment Cole returned to his booth and picked up his coffee. 5 minutes and 43 seconds of unedited footage on screens wide enough that every person in the hall could see every detail without straining. The hall went quiet in a specific way, not the polite quiet of an audience managing their response, but the genuine quiet of thousands of people watching something that was absorbing their full attention against their will. Cole watched the faces around him. He watched a woman in the second row bring her hand to her mouth. He watched a man in a business suit lean forward with his elbows on his knees. He watched the room understand collectively what it was seeing. When the footage ended, Victoria did not rush to fill the silence. She let it sit for a full 10 seconds, which is a very long time when you're in a room with thousands of people and everyone is waiting. Then she said, "The man you just watched walk to that counter is a 37-year-old widowed father who was working 3 jobs to support his 7-year-old daughter. He was not a Hale Dynamics employee. He had no prior connection to our company. He had no angle, no strategy, and no reason to put himself in that position, except that a woman he didn't know needed someone to say something, and he was the only person in that room willing to say it." She paused. "The person whose wrist was grabbed was me." The murmur that moved through the hall was the sound of a room recalibrating. "I was working undercover in service industry positions to understand firsthand what our employees experience," Victoria continued. "What I did not anticipate was that a man with whom we had a previous business dispute would find out where I was working and arrive with 4 bodyguards to make what he considered a point." Her voice was even, controlled, but not cold. There was something underneath the control that the room could hear that gave the words their weight. The point he made instead was that when someone with power decides to reach out and take what they want, the only thing standing between that and consequence is whether someone else in the room is willing to stand up. She turned to the left side of the stage, where 2 large screens now displayed a different image: documentation, formal and clearly organized. Court filings, evidence logs. A photograph of the private investigator's surveillance log with Maisie's school schedule visible. "The man from the diner," Victoria said, "lost 3 jobs within 24 hours of that night. His daughter was followed to school. He received anonymous threats. He was accused, publicly, of being the aggressor in an incident the original footage makes completely clear he did not initiate." She looked out at the hall. "He refused every attempt to buy his silence. He refused our offer to solve this with money. He told me, and I want to quote this correctly because I have thought about it every day since, he told me that justice bought with wealth is never real justice." Cole, in the 4th row, looked at his hands. "Damian Cross was arrested this morning," Victoria said. The hall erupted. Cole had known it was coming. Rebecca had told him the night before, had walked him through the charges, had explained the timing with the summit with the precision of someone who understood that public and legal proceedings were not the same thing, but were not entirely separable either. He'd known. He still felt something when the hall reacted, something physical in the chest that he didn't immediately have a name for. Around him, people were on their phones. The arrest had been executed at 7 that morning, at Cross's residence, in front of 3 of his own security staff. The charges included assault, stalking, conspiracy, witness intimidation, and evidence manipulation. The booking photo would be public within hours. Rebecca had told him all of this the night before with the careful, complete neutrality of a woman who had been building toward this for weeks and was not going to allow herself to feel it until it was fully done. Cole sat in his seat while the hall processed the information around him, and he thought about Sandra Cho, who had kept 11 months of documentation on a personal device and had waited years for a moment when it might be safe to use it. He thought about the other 4 women, whose names he didn't know, who had made the same calculation and arrived at the same moment from different directions. He thought about Rebecca's footnote in the counter motion, precise, and about the paralegal with a sister who had waited 3 years for exactly this. I thought about how the thing that had changed this was not one large act, but an accumulation of small ones. The original decision, in the diner, the refusal to take the settlement twice, the $47 and the watch he'd pawned. Garrett's $300, transferred without a question, Mrs. Peralta's hand on Maisie's shoulder. The principal who had read between the lines. The hall was still buzzing. Victoria was speaking again. The Guardian Workplace Initiative now, the policy framework, the company commitment, The specific and detailed plan that her communications team would later describe as the most substantive corporate accountability announcement in the company's history. Cole listened with part of his attention. The other part was somewhere else entirely. He became aware gradually of a presence to his left. Someone had taken the seat beside him that had been empty when the summit began. He turned. Edward Hale sat beside him in a dark suit, watching his daughter on the stage. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "She's better at this than I was," Edward said quietly. "Yeah," Cole said. "I spent 40 years," Edward said, still watching the stage, "believing that the most important thing in any situation was leverage. Who had it, who wanted it, who you had to cultivate to get it." He paused. "I still think that's largely true." "But," Cole said. Edward looked at him. "But there's something that doesn't reduce to leverage. I've been trying to figure out what to call it." He turned back to the stage. "I think it's just a person who means what they do. The way you meant it, in that diner, the way she means it, up there." Another pause. "I've been in rooms with important people my entire adult life, and I can count on one hand the number who actually meant what they were doing in the way that I mean." Cole looked at Victoria on the stage. She was answering a question now from a journalist who had stood at a microphone. A hard question, pointed, about the company's own historical record on workplace protections, which was not uniformly good, and she was not deflecting it. She was answering it directly, acknowledging what was accurate in the criticism while being specific about what was changing and why. She was good at this. Better than good. She was the kind of person who got better at something difficult in the doing of it, and watching her do it was not a simple experience. "Your daughter is going to be fine," Cole said. "I know," Edward said, with the complicated expression of a father who has known this for longer than he's been able to fully accept it. Around them, the hall was settling back into something like its original order, though changed. The charge in the room now was different from the promotional energy it had held at the start. It was the particular energy of people who had witnessed something they hadn't expected to witness, who were still working out what it meant for them personally, which was the only way anything ever actually landed. Rebecca appeared at Cole's right shoulder, leaning down to speak quietly. "The press is going to want access to you after this. I'd advise a brief statement, something short, factual, that closes the loop on the narrative. I can draft something if you—" "I'll handle it," Cole said. She straightened. "Okay." A pause. "Are you all right?" Cole considered this. The suit that was too formal for his actual life. The $40. The copy shop on Wendell Avenue. Maisie at school right now, with Principal Foster and Wilson at the entrance, having no idea what was happening in this hall. "Getting there," he said, which was the same thing he'd told the man with the rummage sale flyers, and which was still true, and which was, he'd come to believe, probably the most honest answer to that question that anyone was ever able to give. The arrest processed through the afternoon. By evening, the charges had been formally announced by the state attorney's office in a press conference that drew more cameras than most press conferences in the city's recent memory. Damian Cross appeared briefly before being taken to processing, pale, expensively dressed, with the expression of a man who had spent decades believing that moments like this were things that happened to other people, and was finding the adjustment difficult. His attorney read a brief statement that said very little. The cameras caught all of it. Cole watched it on his phone in the parking structure outside the convention center, leaning against the hood of his car in the cold. He watched it to the end. Then he put his phone in his pocket and drove to Maisie's school. She came out through the front entrance at 3:15, backpack on, and she saw his car and her face did the thing it always did. The specific, undisguised light of a kid who is genuinely glad to see her parent, which was a thing Cole had long ago decided he would never take for granted, and never had. She climbed in. She buckled her seatbelt. She looked at him. "You look different," she said. "Do I?" "Yeah, like—" She tipped her head, trying to find it. "Like you finished something." He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, in the coat with the zipper he hadn't fixed yet, with her mother's eyes and her particular way of seeing him more clearly than anyone else had ever managed. "Yeah," he said. "I think we did." She nodded, satisfied, and looked out the window as he pulled out of the school lot, and the city moved past them both in the cold afternoon light, indifferent and alive, exactly as it always had been, which was exactly as it should be. The days immediately after the arrest had a strange, decompressed quality. like the silence after a very loud sound when the air is still adjusting. Cole noticed it in small ways. The anonymous text stopped. The dark sedan didn't reappear outside Maisie's school. His downstairs neighbor, Mr. Foreman, held the building door open for him on a Friday morning and said good morning with the careful overcorrectness of a man who knew he'd been wrong about something and hadn't yet figured out how to address it directly. Cole said good morning back. He didn't make it complicated. Mr. Foreman was 68 years old and had been frightened by a television segment, and frightened people made bad judgments, and that was not a thing that required a confrontation to resolve. What the days after the arrest did require was paperwork, an extraordinary grinding amount of it. Rebecca called him every morning for a week with updates on the legal proceedings, the formal charges, the discovery process, the preliminary hearings at which Cross's attorneys attempted a sequence of procedural maneuvers that Rebecca described with the particular flat effect she used when she found something both predictable and tedious. None of the maneuvers succeeded. The weight of the evidence, combined with the public record that had been building since the summit, made the legal architecture of the case more stable than Cross's team had apparently anticipated, which told Cole that they'd believed, right up until the moment the footage played in that hall, that money and leverage would find a way through. It hadn't found a way through. That was still, some mornings, a fact that Cole had to sit with for a moment before it felt real. Sandra Cho testified at the preliminary hearing 11 days after the arrest. Cole wasn't in the courtroom. Rebecca had advised against it, and he agreed with her reasoning. But Rebecca called him afterward, and for the first time in their entire working relationship, she didn't begin the call with an update. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "She was extraordinary." She sat in that chair and she looked at his attorneys like she'd been waiting her entire professional life for exactly that room. And she answered every question they had with documentation. 11 months of it. They didn't touch her. "How did she seem?" Cole asked. Afterward. Another pause. Like someone who'd put something down that she'd been carrying for a long time, and her arms were shaking a little from the sudden lightness. Rebecca paused again. "She asked me to pass something along to you. She said..." He heard Rebecca referring to a note. She said, "Tell him that the reason I kept the records was because some part of me believed that one day someone would actually want to see them. She wanted you to know that." Cole stood in the kitchen of the apartment on Delancey Street and looked at the drawing on the refrigerator. He'd moved it back from Maisie's room to the kitchen when things had started to resolve, and Maisie had approved the relocation without comment. "Tell her I'm glad someone finally wanted to see them," he said. The copy shop on Wendell Avenue was the last piece of the working life he dismantled in those weeks, and it was the one that felt most like an ending. He'd only been there 2 months. Dev had never stopped being curious about him, and on his last shift he asked directly what Cole was planning to do next. "Not sure yet," Cole said, which was not entirely accurate. There were conversations happening, careful and serious, that hadn't yet resolved into anything definite. But it was close enough to true that it didn't cost him anything to say it. Dev nodded with the philosophical acceptance of a 22-year-old who had not yet learned to be surprised by the unpredictability of what adults did with their lives. "You seem like someone who's good at figuring that out," he said. "Like, not in an obvious way. But you always seemed like you knew what you were doing even when everything was messed up." Cole looked at him. Dev was young enough to believe that appearing calm and knowing what you were doing were the same thing, and old enough that it wouldn't be useful to correct him. "Thanks, Dev," he said. "Good luck with the design program." "Thanks, man." Dev shook his hand with the slightly formal sincerity of someone who wanted to honor the moment correctly. "Hope whatever's next is better." "It's looking that way," Cole said. The conversation that had been building for 3 weeks happened on a Tuesday afternoon in Victoria's working office in the Meridian district, with the winter light coming through the tall windows at the angle it had in early December. Rebecca was there, and Edward, and Victoria, and Cole, and an employment attorney named Christine Park, who said almost nothing during the entire meeting, but whose presence told Cole that whatever was being proposed had been thought through carefully enough that someone had already drafted the legal structure. Victoria set a folder on the table but didn't open it. "Before we get into specifics," she said, "I want to be clear about what this is and what it isn't. This isn't charity. It isn't a reward. It isn't a way of closing a debt I feel toward you, although I do feel one, which I'm aware makes me biased and is why my father and Rebecca are both in this room." She looked at him directly. "This is a job. A real one, with a real structure and real expectations and real accountability. If you're wrong for it, I'll tell you. If you decide it's wrong for you, I expect you to tell me. All right, Cole said. Tell me what it is. She opened the folder. The position was Director of Executive Protection and Community Security, a role that didn't currently exist at Hale Dynamics, and that Victoria had built from the ground up over the past 3 weeks, in consultation with security professionals, human resources specialists, and Rebecca, who had contributed the legal framework for the broader workplace protection mandate that the role would oversee. It was not a ceremonial title. The responsibilities were specific: managing a dedicated team responsible for the physical and procedural safety of Hale Dynamics employees across 4 facilities, with a particular mandate to develop and implement the Guardian Workplace Initiative, the program Victoria had announced at the summit, in partnership with the company's HR leadership. The initiative, as it had been designed, was not just internal. It was a training and consultation framework intended to be offered to other companies. Eventually, if it worked, to companies across multiple industries and regions. The vision, as Victoria described it, was a nationwide program for recognizing and responding to harassment, protecting vulnerable employees, and building cultures where the response to someone being harmed was not to look at the plate in front of you. Cole read through the structure carefully. He asked 5 questions, specific, operational, about reporting relationships, decision-making authority, resource allocation, and what happened when the initiative's recommendations conflicted with a business unit's preferences. Victoria and Edward answered each one without defensiveness, which told him the questions had already been anticipated, and the answers were genuine rather than improvised. He got to the compensation section of the folder and stopped. "That's the number," Victoria said. He looked at it, then he looked up. "This is significantly more than what I was making combined across the 3 jobs." "Yes," she said, "because this is significantly more than 3 jobs." He looked at Rebecca, who gave him the small nod that meant she'd reviewed it and it was legitimate. He looked at Edward, who was watching him with the expression of a man who had made many offers in his life and who understood that the only right response to this particular one was to wait. Cole looked back at the folder. He thought about the $163 that had become $47. The pawned watch. Garrett's $300 that he still owed. The electric bill. The coat with the broken zipper, which he had finally fixed 2 weeks ago with a replacement zipper from a hardware store and 30 minutes of YouTube instruction, because Maisie needed a functioning coat and he was not willing to buy a new one until he'd exhausted the option of repairing the one she had. He thought about what Dev had said. Hope whatever's next is better. He thought about Sandra Cho's arms shaking with the sudden lightness of having put something down. He thought about 11 seconds in a diner on Harlow Street and the particular way a room sounds when everyone has decided to look at their plates. "I'll take it," he said. Christine Park, who had said nothing the entire meeting, produced a pen from somewhere with the quiet efficiency of a person who had been waiting to do exactly that, and slid it across the table. Cole signed the contract on a Tuesday in December, in a room with good light, with the 4 people who had ended up, through no design of anyone's, being the people most responsible for the shape of what had just happened. Rebecca, who had built a case that couldn't be dismantled out of documents and precision, and a footnote that would probably be discussed in certain legal circles for years. Edward, who had been wrong about something and had said so directly, which was rarer and more costly than most people understood. Victoria, who had walked into a diner in a gray uniform because she wanted to understand the truth about other people's lives and had ended up living a version of that truth more directly than she'd planned. And Cole, who had stopped at a diner on Harlow Street at 8:47 on a Wednesday night because he needed 40 minutes and a cup of coffee before a night shift, and who had not looked at his plate. He drove home. He picked Maisie up from school. He made pasta for dinner. He helped her with a worksheet on weather patterns that she found interesting in the particular obsessive way she found things that genuinely interested her. He told her about the job after dinner, sitting at the kitchen table, in the direct way he told her things. She listened. She ate the last of her pasta. She said, "So you don't have to work the night shifts anymore?" "Not those ones," he said. She looked at the table for a moment, then she looked up. "Can we get a real Christmas tree this year? Not the plastic one." Cole laughed. "The real kind. The kind that came up without warning." "Yeah," he said. "We can get a real one." She went to bed satisfied with this outcome, which was the right outcome because she was 7. And Christmas trees were important, and the adult dimensions of what had just changed in their lives were real, but were also, in this moment, less immediately relevant than the question of whether the tree would smell like pine. He sat at the kitchen table after she was asleep and looked at the drawing on the refrigerator for a long time. 3 stick figures, bright crayon, all holding hands. He thought about Rachel, not in the way he'd thought about her in the bad months. That had been a drowning, a going under, the way grief can become its own kind of violence if you let it run long enough without direction. This was different. This was the quieter kind of remembering, the kind that didn't try to reach back and change anything. She was gone. She had been gone for 2 years, and she would be gone for the rest of his life, and there was no version of that fact that didn't carry weight, but the weight had changed shape. It was less like something pressing down and more like something he carried with him, part of the ballast that kept him upright, rather than the thing pulling him under. He thought she would have found the whole story, the diner, the footage, the copy shop, the summit, equal parts infuriating and completely unsurprising. She'd known him well enough to know that he was exactly the kind of man who would get into exactly this kind of trouble by doing exactly this kind of thing, and she'd loved him for it in the specific way you love something about a person that also occasionally drives you insane. He was glad he was still that person. He hadn't been sure, in the worst of those 4 months, whether he would come back to himself or whether the self he came back to would be recognizable. It was. Not undamaged, not unchanged, but recognizable. The same man who walked to the counter. The same man who'd raised Maisie on a different coast with a broken zippered coat and $40 and the absolute conviction that you could not complain about the world and then take the check. That felt like enough. On a quiet Tuesday in December, in a kitchen with a drawing on the refrigerator, it felt like more than enough. The first months of the new role were not smooth. He hadn't expected them to be, and if he had, the reality would have corrected him quickly. Building a team from scratch, inside an organization that had its own culture, its own politics, its own history of doing things a particular way, was not a clean process. He hired 6 people in the first 3 months. A former detective named Okafor, who had spent 15 years in workplace crime investigation, and who had the rare ability to explain complicated things to people who didn't want to hear them. A trauma-informed HR specialist named Diane, who had worked in crisis response for a decade, and whose interview had consisted primarily of her asking him harder questions than he'd asked her, and 4 others who brought different pieces of what the work required. There were friction points. A regional director who felt the initiative was an implicit criticism of his facility's existing protocols and who made his feelings known in the specific passive-aggressive vocabulary of corporate middle management. A legal team that initially treated every proposed policy as a liability risk to be minimized rather than a protection to be implemented. A board member who asked, at an early presentation, whether the initiative would create a culture of over-reporting and whom Victoria had looked at with an expression so precisely calibrated that the board member did not ask a follow-up. Cole worked through the friction points the way he worked through most things, methodically, without drama, with the understanding that resistance was almost always about fear, and that fear responded better to patience than to force. He met with the regional director 3 times over 6 weeks. He brought Diane to the first 2 meetings and let her translate, which she did with a directness that managed to be simultaneously non-threatening and completely clear about what was expected. By the 3rd meeting, the director had stopped being passive-aggressive and started asking genuine operational questions, which was the only productive version of the conversation they'd been trying to have for 6 weeks. The legal team took longer. He'd expected that. The initiative launched formally in March, 4 months after he'd signed the contract. 2 months after Damian Cross had accepted a plea agreement that included 7 felony charges, a 10-year ban from operating in financial services, and a settlement with 6 of the 7 women that, unlike the settlement he'd tried to impose on Cole, had been negotiated on the women's terms rather than his. Rebecca had been involved in those negotiations and had described the final terms as appropriate, which from Rebecca was the equivalent of another person jumping up and down in the street. The launch event was small, deliberately. Victoria had wanted the media moment at the summit. This one was for the people actually doing the work, the HR directors and floor managers and company safety officers from 37 organizations who had agreed to participate in the first cohort of the initiative's training program. Cole stood at the front of the room and talked for 40 minutes without notes about what the training was, what it required, and what it was trying to build. He was not a natural public speaker in the way that some people are. He didn't have the performer's instinct, the easy comfort with a crowd. But he had something that turned out to matter more in that specific room. He had done the thing he was describing. He had been the person in the room when everyone else was looking at their plates, and he had also been the person who'd lost 3 jobs for it, and had $40 and ate cereal for dinner and kept going anyway. The people in the room could feel the difference between that and a presentation. It wasn't subtle. A woman in the 3rd row, a safety manager from a logistics company in the south part of the state, raised her hand during the Q&A and said, "What do you tell people who want to do the right thing but are scared of what it'll cost them?" Cole looked at her. He thought about all the versions of an answer he could give, the policy version, the procedural version, the version that lived in the training materials. He gave the true one. "I tell them the cost is real," he said. "I don't pretend it isn't. It cost me 3 jobs and a month of eating cereal and my father's watch. It's going to cost different things for different people, and some of those things are going to be heavier than what it cost me." He paused. "But here's what I know from the other side of it. The cost of not doing it is something you pay for longer. You don't pay it all at once. You pay it every time you sit in a room afterward and remember that you looked at your plate. That payment doesn't come with a receipt, and it doesn't have a final amount. It just keeps coming." He looked at her directly. "So I tell them, it's going to cost you something either way. Choose which cost you can live with." The room was quiet. The safety manager nodded slowly, wrote something down. The spring brought the kind of gradual, unannounced normalcy that Cole had stopped believing in during the worst of the winter. Maisie finished 2nd grade with an ecosystem project that Priya declared the best in the class, which Maisie reported with the carefully maintained casualness of someone who was extremely pleased but felt it would be unseemly to say so directly. She got a library card from the branch 6 blocks from their apartment and began bringing home stacks of books about animals and weather systems and the deep ocean, and Cole read the ones that interested him, which was most of them, and they talked about them at dinner. He fixed things in the apartment that had been broken for 2 years. A cabinet hinge, a window that didn't seal properly, a bathroom tile that had been lifting at one corner. Small things. The kind of maintenance that gets deferred when every available resource is being directed somewhere more urgent, and that accumulates into a backdrop of low-grade disorder that you stop fully seeing until it's gone. He fixed them on Sunday mornings while Maisie did her reading, working through the list methodically. And when the list was done, the apartment felt different in a way that was difficult to quantify, but was real. He paid Garrett back in April. Called him, told him the transfer was coming, thanked him. "You don't have to thank me," Garrett said. "I know I don't have to," Cole said. "I want to." A pause. "Things okay?" "Yeah," Cole said. "Things are actually okay." "Good." Another pause, the comfortable kind between people who don't need to fill silences. "Maisie's still doing that thing where she corrects adults about animal facts?" "Constantly," Cole said. "A man at the copy shop told her penguins were birds that couldn't swim, and she looked at him like he'd said something personally offensive." Garrett laughed. Cole laughed. It was the ordinary, uncomplicated kind of phone call that ordinary, uncomplicated friendships produce when everything is basically all right, and Cole let it be exactly that. He and Victoria developed a working relationship that was, like most real things, harder to describe than it looked from the outside. They were not similar people. Her instincts and his operated from different premises, and they disagreed often enough that neither of them had to pretend otherwise. She was impatient in ways that he was not. He was slower to trust institutional solutions than she was, which occasionally frustrated her. She had a tendency to solve problems at scale before she'd fully understood them at the individual level, and he had the opposite tendency, which meant they spent a lot of meetings arguing about sequencing. But she had meant what she'd said in the diner, in the pale blue uniform, when she'd told him she'd done the work for real. She'd meant it in the way that mattered, not as a statement about her character, but as evidence of how she operated. She understood something that most people in her position didn't, which was the specific texture of what it cost to work a 6-hour shift in a uniform that had been washed so many times it had lost its original color, and that understanding informed everything she brought to the initiative in ways that couldn't be faked. He trusted her judgment, with reservations. She trusted his, with reservations. That was, in his experience, the functional definition of a real working relationship between two people who took the work seriously. Edward came to one of the initiative training sessions in April. He did not announce himself. He arrived quietly, sat in the back row, and listened for the full 3 hours. Afterward, he waited until the room had cleared, then stood and put on his coat. Cole was stacking materials at the front of the room and noticed him. Edward walked over. He was in his dark suit, the same one he'd worn at the summit, and he stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the empty chairs for a moment. "My wife would have liked this," he said. Not to Cole specifically, just out loud. Cole didn't say anything. He'd learned over the months that Edward occasionally needed space to say something without it being answered. "She used to tell me I was very good at seeing value and very bad at seeing people," Edward said. "She wasn't wrong." He looked at Cole. "What you've built here, it's not flashy. You know that." "I know," Cole said. "It's the kind of thing that works because people actually believe in it, which means it depends entirely on whether the people running it are genuine." He paused. "You are. So is she." He meant Victoria. "Which is rarer than you'd think for something that started the way this did." He put out his hand. Cole shook it. "Take care of my daughter," Edward said. Then catching himself, I don't mean, I know what you mean," Cole said. Edward nodded. He left. Cole went back to stacking materials. The moment that stayed with him, the one that settled into the permanent record of things he would carry with him for the rest of his life, happened on a Saturday in May, in the park 3 blocks from the apartment on Delancey Street. He'd bought Maisie a bicycle for her birthday in March, a used one, green, with white handlebars, found through an online listing for $40 from a family whose daughter had outgrown it. He'd replaced the brake pads and adjusted the seat height and oiled the chain, and for 2 months he'd been running alongside her down the sidewalk with his hand on the back of the seat while she worked through the particular combination of terror and determination that learning to ride a bicycle required. She fell 6 times. He counted. She got back up 6 times, which he also counted, though he didn't tell her he was keeping track because she would have considered that unnecessary. On the Saturday in May, Victoria had come. Not formally invited, it wasn't a formal occasion, just a text from Cole that said Maisie's trying the bike again, park on Delancey if you want to come. He hadn't been sure she would, but she'd appeared at the park entrance at 10 in the morning in jeans and a jacket. Not the composed professional version of herself, but the version that showed up at copy shops in gray uniforms and sat on courthouse steps reviewing evidence on her phone. And she'd brought 2 coffees from the place on the corner. She handed one to Cole. They stood at the edge of the path where it straightened out, watching Maisie do her preliminary adjustments, checking the handlebars, checking the seat height, the little rituals she'd developed over 2 months of practice. "Is she ready?" Victoria asked. "She's been ready for 2 weeks," Cole said. "She just hasn't decided it yet." Victoria looked at him. "That's a very specific thing to know about your kid." "She makes decisions on her own schedule," Cole said. "You push it, and she digs in. You wait, and she gets there." He paused. "She gets it from her mother." Victoria looked back at Maisie. "What was she like, Rachel?" Cole thought about it. "Direct. Funnier than she let most people see. Very hard to fool." He paused. "She had this thing where she'd ask you a question and then wait about 5 seconds longer than was comfortable, and in that 5 seconds you almost always said the truer thing you'd been about to edit out." "That sounds useful," Victoria said. "It was. Also occasionally alarming." Victoria smiled. Not the professional version, but the real one, which he'd seen more often in the past months, and which was different from the other in ways that were hard to name but easy to recognize. Maisie positioned herself at the start of the path. She put her feet on the pedals. She looked down the length of the path with the expression of someone solving a problem that required her full concentration. Then she pushed off. She wobbled in the first 3 seconds, the familiar sideways lurch that had preceded 6 falls. And Cole's hand moved instinctively in front of him, the reflex of a father who had been the one running alongside, before he caught himself and kept still. Because this was the moment, the one that required him to not be there, which was the hardest version of being there. She corrected the wobble herself, and then she was riding. Actually riding, the wheels finding their balance, her body finding the counterintuitive physics of it, the thing that you can't fully teach, and can only wait for the body to understand on its own terms. She went the length of the path and she didn't fall, and she didn't stop, and at the far end she turned, imperfectly, wide, almost running off the edge, and she came back. She was laughing when she reached them. The full, uncontrolled kind that she rarely allowed herself in public. The kind that made her look entirely her age, 7 years old, delighted by a Saturday in May. Cole looked at his daughter and felt something in the center of his chest that was not a named emotion exactly. It was broader and quieter than what named emotions usually were. It was the feeling of having arrived somewhere, not dramatically, not with announcement, but arrived nonetheless. He thought about the night in the copy shop when he'd stood under fluorescent lights, and thought about a thing being nearly built. This was the thing. Not the job, not the court case, not the footage. This. Maisie on a green bicycle, laughing in a park, on a Saturday morning when her father was not working 3 jobs and eating cereal for dinner. He was aware, at the edge of his vision, of Victoria watching him watch Maisie. Maisie rode back toward them and braked, slightly too hard, lurching to a stop, and looked up at her father with the expectant pride of someone who had accomplished something they needed witnessed. "Did you see?" she said. "All of it," Cole said. She looked at Victoria. She and Victoria had met 4 times now, always in professional contexts, always with the slight formality of a child who is deciding what to make of someone new in her father's orbit. Maisie was not a quick truster. She watched people first. "Did you see?" Maisie asked her. "Every second," Victoria said. "You corrected that wobble at the beginning all by yourself. That's the hardest part." Maisie considered this. "Dad wanted to catch me," she said. "I could tell." "He stopped himself," Victoria said. Maisie looked at her father. "Yeah," she said, with the evaluative precision of someone who has just had a theory confirmed. "He's getting better at that." Cole looked at his daughter. "I'm working on it," he said. She handed him the bicycle, which was her way of asking him to hold it, and went to the water fountain at the edge of the path. Cole held the bicycle and stood in the May sun and let himself be for a moment, entirely in this. Not managing it, not taking inventory, not listing options or mapping threats or thinking about what came next. Just here, in this park, on this ordinary, unremarkable Saturday. His daughter's bicycle in his hands, the smell of real coffee, the sound of the city going on around them in its usual indifferent way. Victoria stood beside him and looked at the park, and he stood beside her and looked at the park, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was fine. Not every moment between people who mean something to each other needs to be filled in. Some of the most real ones are the quiet ones, the ones that don't require anything from you except your presence. There's a thing Cole had come to understand, in the months since the diner, not as a conclusion he'd reached all at once, but as something he'd arrived at gradually, the way you arrive at most true things, which is slowly and sideways, and usually without recognizing the moment of arrival until you're already past it. He'd spent a long time believing that the kind of man he'd been trained to be, the version of himself that operated in the dark, in hostile environments, with a team that trusted each other because their lives required it, was something he'd left behind when he signed his separation papers. Something that belonged to a different chapter of his life, sealed off by Rachel's illness and her death and the 4 bad months and the grinding geography of survival. What the diner had shown him and what the months after had confirmed was that it wasn't sealed off. It was just redirected. The same things that had made him good at what he'd done in the teams. The ability to hold still in a moment that demanded panic, to see clearly when clarity was the most difficult thing, to make a decision and act on it without the luxury of certainty. Those things didn't expire. They just waited for the right application. Protecting people, it turned out, did not require a war. It required a room with a counter and a woman with a red mark on her wrist and the ability to walk toward the thing everyone else was walking away from. It required documentation and attorneys and the willingness to eat cereal for dinner and not take the check. It required a 7-year-old who said we've done hard before and was right. He'd spent years believing that the most important work he'd ever do was behind him, that the meaningful version of his life had been the operational one, and what came after was just maintenance, keeping himself upright, keeping Maisie fed and safe, getting through the days until enough days had accumulated to constitute something. He knew now that this was wrong, not because what came before didn't matter. It did. It shaped everything. But because the future is not a diminished version of the past. It's its own thing, built from what you carry forward and what you choose to do with it, And it turns out that what you carry forward includes more than you think. He was 37 years old. He had a daughter who could ride a bicycle now. He had a job that was difficult and imperfect and not remotely finished. He had a debt to Garrett that was paid, and a watch he'd never replaced, and a suit that still smelled faintly of a courthouse, and a drawing on the refrigerator of 3 stick figures holding hands that was going to be on that refrigerator for as long as he had one. He had the knowledge, which he had not had before the diner, and which he could not unknow, that a single moment of deciding not to look at your plate could change the shape of more lives than you'd ever be able to fully count. That was enough. That was, in the accounting that actually mattered, considerably more than enough. Maisie came back from the water fountain and took the bicycle and looked up the path with the expression of someone who had one successful run behind her and was already calculating the next one. "Again," she said. Not a question. "Again," Cole said. She pushed off. The bicycle found its balance. She went down the path in the Maylight, steady and determined and entirely herself. And Cole watched her go with his coffee in his hand and the city around him, and the full, ordinary, unremarkable Saturday, stretching out in every direction, unhurried, asking nothing, offering everything. He watched his daughter ride until she was a small green shape at the far end of the path, and then he watched her turn and come back toward him, and he did not move to catch her. He just waited. She came back every time.